You won't believe what happened when my HOA decided to take control of something that's been part of my property for generations, my spring water. They claimed it was all about flood risk, but it felt more like an excuse to drain my land dry and squeeze me out. Imagine waking up one day to find the water that fed your garden, your animals, even your family's needs, suddenly gone. No warning, no real explanation, just a letter saying, "We're redirecting the water for safety." It felt like they were turning their backs on the very community they promised to protect. The whole situation quickly spiraled into something much bigger than a simple water dispute. The HOA board members, people I once thought were reasonable neighbors, became relentless, pushing their flood risk narrative with an iron fist. Their homes sat comfortably, but my land, it was drying up, becoming unusable. And worse, it was clear they didn't care about the consequences. When I realized I couldn't just sit back and watch, if they were going to play dirty with my water, I had to fight back in a way they never saw coming. This isn't just a story about water or land. It's about power, control, and what happens when people in charge forget they're supposed to serve the community, not bully it. The tension between me and the HOA grew, and soon enough, their well-manicured lawns started to face a new challenge. The tables were about to turn in ways that no one expected, especially not the HOA board. I won't spoil the surprise yet, but let's just say their homes won't stay dry for long. Stay with me as I take you through how this battle over spring water turned into a swampy nightmare for the HOA, and why this fight is far from over. For years, my property had this natural spring, a constant, peaceful source of fresh water that nourished everything around it. It wasn't just water. It was part of my family's history, something we cared for and respected. When the HOA started whispering about flood risk, it felt out of nowhere. At first, I thought maybe they were just worried about safety, like any reasonable community would be. But the more I listened, the more it became clear they had other motives. They weren't worried about flooding, they were worried about control. The HOA's actions weren't sudden. It started with small changes, new regulations about water use meetings I wasn't even invited to, and vague threats about fines if I didn't comply. I tried to speak up, tried to explain how important the spring was, but my concerns fell on deaf ears. They called in experts who backed their claims, but the reports were confusing and, frankly, felt biased. The flood risk they talked about didn't seem to exist, at least not the way they described it. What made things worse was how the HOA board acted like they were above the rules. They made decisions behind closed doors, shutting out anyone who didn't agree. Neighbors who once greeted me with smiles now avoided eye contact. Caught between loyalty to the HOA and what they knew was happening to my land, it was isolating. But I wasn't about to back down, and then came the biggest blow. Without warning, they started rerouting the spring water. My fields, once lush, began to dry up. The ground cracked, plants withered, and the animals grew restless. Meanwhile, the HOA's own properties stayed untouched, their lawns greener than ever. It felt like a personal attack, a way to make me suffer for standing my ground. But I had a plan brewing, something to make them rethink their actions. The fight was far from over, and the next move would change everything as the water drained away. The ripple effects on my property were impossible to ignore. What used to be a thriving garden now looked like a forgotten patch of earth. My animals, used to the fresh spring water, grew uneasy. Even my family felt the tension, caught between frustration and worry about what this fight with the HOA might cost us. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about standing up to a system that seemed to value control over community. Meanwhile, inside the HOA, things were heating up in ways I hadn't expected. Rumors started circulating that some board members had personal interests tied to the land nearby, possibly benefiting from the new water diversion. It wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. There were whispers of greed and favoritism. I reached out to a few neighbors who shared my concerns. But many were too scared to speak openly, worried about retaliation or being ostracized. The HOA's tight grip on the neighborhood made it clear they wanted to keep this conflict under wraps. On the other side, the HOA kept pushing their flood risk narrative hard, sending out notices and hosting meetings to justify their actions. They brought in engineers to back up their claims, showing diagrams and data that painted my property as a potential hazard. But behind the polished presentations, questions lingered. Was the flood risk real, or just a convenient excuse to redirect my water and push me out? This growing tension spilled over into daily life. I found myself constantly watching the land, noticing how the redirected water changed the flow, turning some areas into soggy, swamp-like patches. It was ironic. While they said they were preventing floods, parts of their own neighborhood were starting to resemble wetlands. The HOA's own homes were beginning to face problems they claimed to prevent on my land. With every meeting, every letter, and every dry patch on my property, the conflict deepened. The community I once trusted felt divided, and I realized this fight was about much more than water. It was about fairness, respect, and standing up to power. But what I planned next would shake things up even more, pushing this battle into new, unexpected territory. As the weeks went by, the situation grew more tense and personal. The dry patches on my land were now impossible to ignore, and every conversation with the HOA felt like a battle. Their messages became more aggressive, hinting at fines and legal actions if I didn't comply with their water restrictions. But I knew something had to be done. Watching my property suffer while their homes started showing signs of water problems felt like a cruel joke. The flood risk they warned about was becoming more real, but in a way they hadn't expected. I started digging deeper, quietly gathering evidence. I took photos of the water flow changes, recorded the wet, swampy areas popping up around the HOA homes, and talked to experts who began questioning the official flood risk reports. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA's story wasn't adding up. This was more than just a dispute over water. It was a cover-up, and I was determined to expose it. Neighbors who had stayed silent started reaching out. Some shared their own concerns about how the HOA was handling water and land management. Others admitted they were worried about what might happen if they spoke out, but they wanted change. The tension was rising, and suddenly, what had seemed like a private fight was turning into something much bigger, real community issue. One evening, after a particularly heated HOA meeting where my protests were ignored and my questions deflected, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The signs of flooding near the HOA homes were growing worse, and my property's water was still being drained. Something had to give. I began setting a plan in motion, not just to protect what was mine, but to force the HOA to face the consequences of their decisions. The next days would bring moments no one saw coming. The battle over the spring water was about to reach a breaking point, and neither side was prepared for what was coming. The question wasn't just who would win, was how far things would go before it was over. Just when I thought the battle was heating up enough, something unexpected happened that turned everything on its head. Late one night, while reviewing some of the water flow data and aerial photos I'd collected, I noticed something strange: a hidden drainage system running beneath parts of the HOA properties. This wasn't in any of the official plans or permits. It looked like someone had been redirecting not just my spring water, but entire streams underground, right under everyone's noses. Suddenly, the flood risk they warned about didn't seem accidental or genuine. It looked manufactured. I decided to dig deeper, literally and figuratively, as I asked more questions. A few of the braver neighbors whispered rumors about secret deals between some HOA board members and a local developer. The suggestion was chilling. Maybe this whole flood risk story was a setup to devalue my land and clear the way for new construction or a big project that no one had been told about. If that was true, then my fight was no longer just about water. It was about exposing a much bigger scheme. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was stronger than I thought. As I pushed harder, they started sending notices that hinted at legal action, threats designed to intimidate me into silence. But instead of backing down, the discovery of this hidden drainage system gave me new fuel. I knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about protecting my spring anymore. It was about stopping something that could impact the whole community. The tension between me and the HOA reached a new peak. Every phone call, every message, every meeting became charged with suspicion and fear. The swampy conditions creeping onto their properties seemed less like accidents, and more like a warning that the consequences of their actions were about to come home to roost. The community was watching, but no one knew what would happen next. This secret drainage system and the possible hidden agenda behind it changed everything. What started as a fight over spring water was becoming a battle against something far bigger and more dangerous. The moment when it all came crash. The moment everything came to a head was like something out of a movie. After weeks of digging, gathering evidence, and facing constant pressure from the HOA, I decided it was time to confront them publicly. One organized a neighborhood meeting, inviting everyone, including the board members, local officials, and even the media. I presented the photos, the maps showing the hidden drainage system, and the reports from independent experts who confirmed that the flood risk was exaggerated and, in some ways, engineered to justify draining my spring water. The room was thick with tension. Some board members tried to dismiss the evidence, but the facts were hard to ignore. This secret drainage system wasn't just a mistake or oversight, it was deliberately installed to divert water away from certain areas and flood others, including parts of the HOA properties themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same people who claimed to protect the neighborhood were creating the very swamps they feared. As the truth came out, the community's mood shifted. Neighbors who had been silent before started speaking up, sharing their own stories of mismanagement and hidden agendas. The local officials promised to investigate further, and suddenly, the power dynamic flipped. The HOA board members who had pushed the flood risk narrative found themselves on the defensive. But just as it seemed like the fight was over, there was one last shock. A whistleblower stepped forward, a longtime HOA employee, revealing that some board members had been planning to sell parts of the neighborhood to developers for a big project. And the flood risk story was a smokescreen to push residents out quietly. This revelation changed everything, turning a water dispute into a battle for the future of the whole community. The climax didn't end with neat answers or easy victories. Instead, it opened a new chapter of resistance and hope. The HOA's control was shaken, but the fight to protect the land and the community was far from finished. What started as a battle over spring water became a powerful story about standing up to injustice no matter the cost. And for me, that was just the beginning. After that explosive meeting, things started to change in ways I hadn't imagined. The local authorities launched a full investigation into the HOA's actions, focusing on the hidden drainage system and the plans to sell parts of the neighborhood. The board members involved faced serious questions, and some even stepped down. Amid growing pressure, it was a hard-fought victory, but it felt like justice for my family and the community we all cared about. The spring water slowly began to flow back to my land, bringing life and hope where there had been dryness and uncertainty. My garden revived, and the animals returned to their usual routines. More importantly, the community started to heal. Neighbors who had been divided by fear and silence came together to discuss how to protect our shared resources and make sure something like this never happened again. It wasn't just about water. It was about trust, respect, and standing up for what's right. Looking back, I realized this fight was about much more than property or water rights. It was about the courage to question authority when things don't feel fair and the power that comes from speaking out. The HOA's attempt to control and manipulate the situation showed how easy it is for those in power to forget their responsibility to the people they serve. But it also showed how strong a community can be when it refuses to stay silent. This story isn't just mine. It's a reminder to anyone facing unfair treatment or feeling powerless that change is possible. Sometimes the biggest battles start with standing up for what seems small, like a spring of water, but the impact can be huge. And even when the fight gets tough, holding on to hope and truth can turn the tide. Thanks for following this story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA or felt your voice wasn't heard, I hope this inspires you to keep standing strong. The fight might not be easy, but it's worth it.